After you finish listening to the story, don't forget to leave a comment about what you would have done in the character's place. Now, let's dive into the story. In the busy hum of a modern city, where lives collide and secrets fester under the polished surface of daily routines, Dora sat in her kitchen, stirring a cup of coffee. The steam rose, filling the room with the rich scent that momentarily masked the lingering bitterness she had carried for years. Her husband, Rick, had been home for only a few minutes, but it was enough to remind her of everything that had gone wrong. Dora was an intelligent woman, a former artist who had traded her easel for the quiet life of a corporate wife. She'd once believed that love could be enough to overcome anything, but after Rick's affair, several years ago, with a woman she had never met, she learned just how fragile trust really was. The emotional wounds, though buried beneath layers of everyday life, had never truly healed. Her heart had never fully forgiven him. Not once had he shown genuine remorse. Not once had he made her feel like she mattered. Rick, on the other hand, was a man who valued comfort, stability, and his image. He worked as an investment banker, successful but emotionally distant, more invested in his career than the intricacies of his marriage. His affair had been a momentary lapse in judgment, something he had brushed off as a mistake, a phase, but to Dora, it was the ultimate betrayal. The years had passed, but the damage lingered. It had eaten away at her. His cold indifference, the casual way he continued life as if nothing had happened, had pushed her to the edge. Dora's eyes wandered to the window, her thoughts drifting back to the day she had learned the truth. Rick's affair hadn't been some fleeting tryst. It had lasted months, and it was only the unexpected discovery of an old email that shattered the illusion of their perfect life. The betrayal was not just about the act itself but about the lies and the dismissiveness that followed. Rick had asked for her forgiveness, but the guilt that clung to her heart was suffocating, a constant reminder of the trust she could never regain. She had spent years putting on a facade, loving wife, supportive partner, while her insides twisted with resentment. What had she ever received in return for loyalty? The answer came easily: nothing. Rick entered the room with a casual greeting, too absorbed in his phone to notice the tension thick in the air. Dora didn't respond, but instead, her mind began to formulate a plan. The idea had come to her like a fleeting thought one evening while she was out with her friends. She'd never considered revenge before, but something about the way her husband continued to take her for granted, as if his past actions could be buried under years of normalcy, stirred something in her. Dora had always been capable of planning, of making things happen when she wanted them to. And now, she was determined to make him feel the same kind of pain she had endured for so long. The affair had never been about love for Rick, it had been a means to an end, a moment of weakness. But for Dora, the affair had been an awakening. If he could betray her so easily, why couldn't she? What was stopping her from reclaiming her power in this relationship? Dora's thoughts turned darker as she began to consider the details of her plan. It had to be someone Rick would never suspect. It had to be carefully orchestrated. She couldn't afford to be careless, but the idea of him finding out about her own infidelity, of seeing the look in his eyes when the truth hit him, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. It wasn't just about the act itself, it was about showing Rick that she could move on, that she was no longer the woman he had left behind. It was a form of control, of dominance. And deep down, Dora knew that the only way to truly regain her sense of self was to make him feel the pain he had never truly understood. But there was a problem, an unexpected one. As Dora began to set her plan into motion, the weight of her own decisions began to gnaw at her. The first steps were easy. She had met a man at a charity event, a charming, well-connected individual named James. He was wealthy, sophisticated, and completely unaware of the complexities of her marriage. He was the perfect candidate. But as she spent more time with him, as their connection grew deeper than she had anticipated, a conflict arose within her. Was she really doing this for revenge, or was she simply trying to prove something to herself? And worse, was this something she could live with? In the days that followed, Dora's feelings became tangled. Her guilt, once a distant companion, now whispered in her ear. She began to question her motives, to wonder if she was truly capable of going through with it. The lines between punishment and desire blurred, and Dora found herself standing at a crossroads. Rick, oblivious to her internal struggle, continued his life, unknowingly heading towards a reckoning he could not avoid. The plan was simple: she would give in to her emotions, to her desire for control, but at what cost? Would Rick ever find out? And if he did, would it shatter their already fragile marriage beyond repair? The thought haunted Dora as she prepared for the next step in her tangled web. The days passed in a blur of anxious anticipation. Dora found herself torn between two worlds: the reality of her marriage and the new, seductive power she felt in her affair with James. At first, it had been a simple distraction, a way to escape the emotional prison she had built around herself. But now, as her feelings deepened, so did her conflict. James was everything Rick was not: attentive, passionate, and emotionally available. The connection between them grew stronger with each passing day. Dora couldn't deny the chemistry, the way he made her feel seen, heard, and desired in a way she had not felt in years. He listened to her, truly listened, and for the first time in a long time, Dora felt alive. But guilt gnawed at her. The more she became involved with James, the more the weight of her betrayal against Rick settled over her. It was as if her entire identity, everything she had built for herself in the quiet suburbs of their life together, was crumbling with every stolen moment. Rick had always been oblivious to Dora's internal struggles. He went about his day with a predictable ease, absorbed in his work, his social status, his carefully crafted persona of the perfect husband. He never questioned her late nights, her distant gaze, or the way she seemed to disappear into herself. Dora began to resent him for it, for his lack of awareness, and for his insistence on living in a world of false comforts. But as the weeks went on, it became increasingly clear that Dora's actions were not just about revenge, they were also about self-preservation. She wasn't just trying to hurt Rick, she was trying to reclaim something she had lost within herself. In her relationship with James, she had found a fleeting sense of freedom, something that had been stripped away from her during the years of neglect. One evening, as Dora and James sat at a cozy, dimly lit restaurant in the heart of the city, the truth of what she was doing finally hit her. James had just said something sweet, something that made her heart skip a beat. He had no idea about the storm she was brewing at home. She forced a smile, but inside, the weight of the situation bore down on her like a heavy burden. "Dora," James said softly, his hand gently resting on hers across the table, "I feel like we've known each other forever. There's something about you. Something I can't quite explain. I think I'm falling for you." The words hit her like a thunderclap. She had expected this, of course. James wasn't the type to hide his feelings, and his confession, while flattering, only served to complicate things further. Dora hadn't planned on falling for him. She had never expected to care. But now, with those words hanging in the air between them, she realized just how much she had allowed herself to get swept up in this affair. Her mind raced. Was she really willing to throw everything away, her marriage, her family, the life she had built for years, on a fleeting affair that, in the grand scheme of things, might not even last? What if Rick found out? What if he learned the truth about her and James? Would he even care? Or would he simply see it as another betrayal, another chapter in their broken marriage? Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Rick. It was simple, almost too simple, but it made her heart sink. "Where are you? It's late." Dora froze, staring at the message. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, pretending that nothing was wrong, that everything was fine. But the reality of the situation hit her with full force. She had crossed a line. She couldn't go back now, not without facing the consequences of her actions. She excused herself from the table and stepped outside to make the call. Her hands trembled as she dialed Rick's number. "Hey," she said, her voice steady but not without a hint of tension. "I'm out with some friends. I'll be home soon." She hung up before he could respond. The life felt hollow, a crack in the foundation of everything she had built. The weight of her deception pressed down on her chest, but it also made her feel something else, a strange, exhilarating sense of power. As she walked back into the restaurant, James was still sitting at the table, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside her. She tried to smile, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the tangled mess of her emotions. Later that night, as Dora lay in bed next to Rick, the quiet of the room was deafening. The tension between them was palpable, though neither of them spoke about it. Dora turned over, her back to him, and closed her eyes, her thoughts consumed by the affair and the decision she had yet to make. The following week, Rick's suspicions started to surface. He was distant in a way that Dora hadn't seen before. He asked more questions, lingered a little longer when she was getting ready to leave for work, and seemed to be watching her more closely. Dora felt the weight of his gaze on her, sensing that something was off, but she couldn't quite place it. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Rick dropped a bombshell. "I've been thinking about something," he began, his voice unusually serious. "I know things haven't been the same between us lately. I don't know what's going on, but I can feel that there's something you're not telling me." Dora's heart raced. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "I'm not blind, Dora," Rick continued, his voice growing more intense. "I know something's off. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Dora's stomach churned. The truth was out there, hovering just beneath the surface. And Rick, for all his emotional distance, was finally catching on. The atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken words. Dora sat in the dimly lit living room, the silence stretching between her and Rick like a chasm neither of them could cross. His words from dinner still echoed in her mind. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." She couldn't help but wonder if Rick had suspected something for longer than she realized, or if he was just now starting to connect the dots. The following days were a whirlwind of tension and avoidance. Dora couldn't bring herself to confess to Rick, not yet. The guilt was eating her alive, but the thought of admitting the truth, of tearing their already fragile world apart, was something she couldn't face. Every time she looked at Rick, his cold, calculated expression reminded her of all the years of betrayal and deceit that had come before. Her own affair, which had started as an act of revenge, now felt like an act of self-destruction. Rick, on the other hand, seemed to be retreating further into himself. His usual charm, the mask of the perfect husband and father, had started to slip. His distance from Dora was palpable, his nights at work stretching longer, his eyes dull and distracted when he did come home. It was as if he was waiting for something to break, waiting for the moment when the truth would come crashing down. Dora had always been able to read Rick, to anticipate his moods, but now she found herself on edge, wondering when he would confront her. Wondering if she could continue this charade for just a little longer. She was no longer sure of herself. She had gotten in too deep. One evening, after another long day of strained conversations, Rick came home late, his coat thrown carelessly over the chair. He didn't look at her immediately, but the tension between them was like a physical weight. Dora knew that this would be the night. He was going to confront her, and there would be no more hiding. "Rick," she said softly, breaking the silence, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. He looked up, his eyes cold. "What's going on, Dora?" Her stomach turned. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but now that it was here, she found herself at a loss for words. How could she explain the years of hurt and betrayal? How could she make him understand that her affair, her actions, weren't just about him, it was about her reclaiming the pieces of herself she had lost in their marriage? Rick took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, Dora. I know what you've been doing." Dora's heart sank. He knows. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating her. She felt the ground slip from under her, as if everything she had built, her defenses, her excuses, had just been shattered in an instant. "I didn't want to confront you like this," Rick continued, his voice edged with something Dora couldn't quite place. "But I've seen the way you've been acting. The late nights. The distance. I know you've been seeing someone else." Dora's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The truth had come out and there was no turning back. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. The realization that Rick knew everything felt like a punch to the gut. I never wanted this, she finally managed to say, her voice shaky. It wasn't about you. It wasn't about the affair. It was about me, Rick. It's about everything that's been wrong between us. All the things you've never seen. Rick stared at her, his face unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, without warning, Rick stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're right, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on her. I didn't see it. I didn't see any of it. But now I do. He took a step back, the hurt in his eyes palpable. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Dora. Dora felt a pang in her chest. His words were like a blade, cutting through the thin veneer of hope she had clung to. Forgiveness. That word, once so simple in her mind, now seemed impossible. Rick ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I thought I could forget about the affair. I thought it was just a mistake, something that happened because we'd lost our way. But now I don't even know who you are anymore. Dora wanted to reach out to him, to explain, to make him understand that she had never meant for any of this to happen, that it was all born out of years of neglect, of pain. But the words caught in her throat. There was no explanation that could undo what she had done. Rick paced the room, his mind seemingly racing. I don't know how we can move past this. I don't even know if I want to try. Dora's heart shattered. She had known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. The guilt that had been building inside her now consumed her whole. She had crossed a line, and now she had no idea how to fix it. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words feeling too small, too insignificant in the face of the wreckage she had caused. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could get back at you, but all I've done is destroy everything. Rick looked at her, his expression hardening. And now what? You expect me to just forgive you? To pretend like this doesn't change everything? Dora shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. No. I don't know what I expect. I don't even know what I want anymore. Rick stood there for a long moment, staring at her, his face a mask of anger and pain.